Welcome to the Plant Fit Summit, bringing you the best in plant-based health and fitness. This is Luke and Toby, and today we have Brett Stuleberg. Brett researches, writes, speaks, and coaches on health and human performance. His coaching practice includes working with executives, entrepreneurs, physicians, and athletes on their mental skills and overall well-being. He has also written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, New York Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Wired, Outside Magazine, and Forbes. We start the conversation with Brett sharing about why we don't naturally perform at our peak capacity. Enjoy the presentation.
I think that we don't naturally perform at our peak because we often get in our own way. And we have these long-standing habits, many of which were programmed into us by evolution, that work really well in some circumstances, but not necessarily so well in others. And when we start to rely on one way of being for all circumstances, we can fall into traps. So it's this very fascinating process where if you don't know what you're doing at all, you're not going to reach your best. If you know what you're doing, but you're highly focused on it, that works really well for improvement. But then eventually that can get in your way because you become so focused and consciously aware of everything that you can't kind of just release and let go into a flow state where you attain peak performance. So it's this either not knowing or knowing and becoming attached.
You mentioned a few habits that were basically adopted through evolution, which stand in our way. What are those habits if you were to list a few or, like highlight one or two?
So I think the one that is most, I guess maybe the two that are most prominent right now is we are creatures that are designed for distraction. So when we were evolving and our species was transitioning from primates to humans, it was very, very, very important that we would always be scanning our environment. I'm looking around, granted I'm in my apartment, but always be scanning our environment because there could be potential predators that were out to get us, or there could be food that we would need to kill and save for a time of famine. So the human brain evolved to constantly be scanning. That served us really well back then because it allowed us to avoid predators and it allowed us to maintain and stock up on food. So it's a great strategy for passing on your DNA, but it's not necessarily a great strategy for living a full, thriving, high-performing life in the 21st century. Because that scanning part of our brain now is not looking for predators, it's looking at Twitter or Facebook or the news or the to-do list or all of these other things. So we're really not wired to get into these deep focus states that support peak performance. We're actually wired to be distracted. There's a reason that all of these apps on our phones and so much of digital media has such an addictive pull to it. And that's because the designers of those apps know very well that we're wired to be distracted. So part of that is becoming aware of it and then working to overcome that inclination towards distraction. And then another example, particularly because I know you all focus at least a little bit on nutrition, is again, during our evolution, their food was scarce. So people often talk about the paleo diet being, just meat. But the truth is that if a paleo caveman saw a Krispy Kreme, he would gorge on donuts and eat himself to death because we're wired to get that sugar because, again, it's fast energy for a potential time of famine. Well, back in our evolution, the goal was, again, just to pass on your DNA. So you only needed to live if you were a woman to be maybe 15, 16, if you were a man to be maybe 16 to 18, and that's it. So we adopted these behaviors that were really beneficial to pass on your DNA in a time of like constant famine, but in today's world, again, aren't that beneficial to living a full, healthy, high-performing life. So those are two that come to mind and that get in the way of a lot of people.
That makes total sense. And no one is really born a master in any area of life. We have to practice in a sense. And in your book, you outline a growth equation. How did you discover it? And can you share with us how we could implement it in whichever area we want to master?
So the growth equation is this concept that stress plus rest equals growth. And I've yet to find an area of life where it doesn't apply. And the first thing that's important to unpack is that I use stress not as the kind of stress that you might feel if you are in an argument with your romantic partner, or if you're nervous before a performance review at your office, but more so in a scientific sense. So stress means some kind of stimulus or challenge. And after that stimulus or challenge, you rest and recover. And if you can repeat that cycle, then you get growth. So the easiest example to describe is in physical fitness. So let's say that you want to make your arm, your bicep muscle bigger. Well, the way to do that is to stress it, to lift the weight, and then let it rest and recover, and it grows. If you stress it way too much, you pick up way too heavy of a weight, you're going to injure yourself. If you don't stress it enough and you just pick up a 1 pound weight, you could sit there and do bicep curls all day. Your muscle's not going to grow. So you have to find the right amount of stress. That's half the equation, because even let's say that the right amount of stress for me is a 35-pound weight. Well, if I find that weight, but I just sit there and lift weights every day, all day without any rest in between, my physical muscle is literally going to burn out. So you have to challenge it at the right dose, but then also let it rest and recover, because that's when a muscle grows. Now, it turns out that the human brain and the human psychological immune system and emotional system all work the exact same way. So you have to apply some kind of stress or some kind of challenge, and then build in enough time to rest, recover, reflect, and then you get growth. There's some fascinating research that shows that even organizations grow in the same way. So if a small organization tries to do way too much too soon, they often don't make it to the next year. Whereas if an organization never challenges themselves or never takes on new products or services, when the environment changes, they get selected out. A great example of that is like a Blockbuster Video when Netflix came along. So this equation really applies. It applies to relationships, it applies to intellectual growth, and it applies certainly to health habits. So if you are somebody that has had a really unhealthy relationship with food and a poor diet, and you just say, I'm going to go for broke and I'm going to get on the healthiest whole food diet tomorrow, you might last for a day or two, but that's way too much stress to your system. Whereas if you said, hey, this is going to be a real challenge, so I'm going to start small and I'm going to incrementally increase the level of change. And I'm going to make sure I build in time for some rest and reflection in between to see how it's going and adjust. That is by far, according to the evidence, the most sustainable route to success. So it's taking on some sort of just manageable challenge, something that will stimulate you, but is not way too much. It's not picking up the 50-pound weight and injuring yourself. And then it's making sure that you build in periods to rest, reflect, and recover, so that you can adjust, get stronger, and grow.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned that you would be looking for an adequate stress or stimulus in that sense. How do you know what is too much?
I love it. Everybody asks me that question. So it's so easy in the weight room because everything is so objective and well-defined. So you go from 20 to 25 pounds, and then you go to 30. And then if 30 is too heavy, you go back down to 25. Well, if you're in a marriage or you're running a company, it's not as simple as, oh, we're going to go from, having a pet dog to having a kid. Like, no one says that there's this very clearly defined path. So what I found in my research and reporting on the book is that there are 3 mental models that can really help people identify what the right dose of stress is. So the first is to think about a 7 out of 10. So if a 1 out of 10 is completely going through the motions, you could do it in your sleep, it's boring. And a 10 out of 10 is you can't fall asleep because you're anxious about the thing. You want to shoot for just around a 7. So something that arouses you and stimulates you, and you're not positive if you're going to get it right, but something that doesn't necessarily cause you to wake up having a panic attack or causes anxiety. Another way to think about it is to pick the area that you want to improve in your life and to say, here's where I'm at right now. Here's where I want to go. What's the next logical step? And it's so simple, but when most people go through that exercise, they do a very good job defining what that next logical step is. So we could go through an example. So give me an area to put you on the spot. So give me an area of your life where you want to grow.
Okay, let's call it endurance for sports.
Okay, endurance for sports. And where do you want to go? Like, what would be a nice goal? Where do you envision yourself a year from now? Where would you like to be?
I used to play a lot of basketball. Nowadays, I mean, obviously with COVID around as well, it's so much harder and endurance is out the window. But if I would be able to play, 2 hours of basketball, obviously in recreational sense, that would be great.
Okay. And where do you think you are right now? How long do you think you could last in a game without being wiped out?
Probably 40 minutes, 45 minutes of an intensive game. And then it's probably then I call it a day.
Yeah. So what do you think would be the next logical step? And we could do it in a COVID world or in a world where COVID's not as much of a concern. So you're at 45 minutes right now. A year from now, you'd love to be able to go play pickup basketball for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. What do you think the next logical step is in getting from 45 minutes to 2 hours?
Yeah, I would probably start with running stairs, finding stairs that lead up into the forest, and then work my way up, because stairs simulate very closely what happens on a basketball court.
Yep. And how many days a week do you think makes sense to do that at first?
That would probably be 2 times a week at first, and then going to 3 times max, but not more than that.
Yep. So that's probably the right amount of stress, right? And then you go test that and you have someone hold you accountable. And then if after 2 times a week for a month, you feel totally wiped out, maybe you go down to 1 time a week. Or maybe you do 3 times a week, but you only go up halfway. Or if after a month, 2 times a week starts to feel easy, then maybe you go to 3 or 4 times a week. Or instead of just doing it once, you do it twice. So that starting point is really important. And then from there, you ratchet it up. And then the last way to think about it, so it's a 7 out of 10. It's what's the next logical step. Another framing that works for a lot of people is to think of it as a just manageable challenge. So something that's just outside of your comfort zone. Not way too far out, because that's too much stress. That's picking up the 50-pound weight, but not something that's inside your comfort zone, because you're not going to grow. So it's just getting ever so slightly outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So how do you find the right ratio between levels of stress, and then how long is the recovery? Is your body telling you, or
so in theory, the recovery should mirror the level of stress. And this is a very individual equation, because for you, playing 2 hours of basketball might be a huge stressor that would take a ton of recovery. Whereas for LeBron James, or, I'm trying to think who's like the most fit basketball player.
Maybe Russell Westbrook.
Yeah, Russell Westbrook. That guy's an animal. Yeah. So Russell Westbrook, 2 hours isn't going to require much recovery at all. So it's whatever the personal challenge is. And it's just really, like you said, listening to your body, listening to your mind. And if something feels like a really big stressor for you, then the rest is going to be bigger. So an example for me as a writer would be, if I write a magazine essay or an essay for a big newspaper, and it really requires a lot of work, but I do that quite often, my rest and recovery from that might only be like a half day where I'm not really thinking about writing. Or maybe it's a day where I'm reading, but I'm not actively writing, because that was a hard challenge and I really worked myself. Whereas if I submit a manuscript for a book, then my rest might be a month of not thinking about writing, because the effort, the stress level, the challenge level of writing a book is so much greater than a single column. Now, maybe one day I'll get to a point in my life where I have 20 books and writing a book doesn't seem that stressful. So as your fitness for whatever you're doing increases, the amount of rest that you need decreases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you bring up a very fascinating point, which is that our mind almost functions like a muscle, and that if we have decision fatigue,
Yep.
or we face constant temptations, we might be tired at the end of the day and maybe give in. Can you share a bit more about what you find out about this problem where we take our mind for granted?
So it's exactly that. Our brain gets tired just like our bodies. So there's all kinds of research that shows that the more decisions that you're making throughout the day, and certainly if they're challenging decisions, or the more challenges you take on throughout the day, the more tired your brain gets at night. So an example of this would be people that are on, this is such an extreme study, but no one ever forgets the point after I share this. So people that are on very restrictive diets that feel like they're constantly having to exert their willpower are significantly more likely to cheat on their significant others than those that aren't. Because when you're on a diet, every minute, in a sense, you're, oh, I can't eat that, I can't eat that. You're exerting so much willpower. And then nighttime rolls around, and there's an attractive person at the bar, and you have no more willpower left. Now, again, that's a very extreme example, but there are all kinds of examples that aren't as extreme. And I think just about anybody knows this. If you have a really challenging day at work, your temper is probably going to be a lot shorter with your kids. And what I make of this is it doesn't make sense to take on way too many challenges at the same time. It's a lot better to be intentional and say, this is the area of my life I'm really going to focus on improving in, and I'm not going to worry too much about other areas. This goes against the kind of popular self-help new year, new you, which says, I'm going to go on a new diet. I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week. I'm going to fix my marriage. I'm going to publish that first book. I'm going to get promoted at the office. I'm going to do all these things. And then what ends up happening is you do none of them because it's just constant stress. So I think a much better approach, and what I counsel clients on, is to pick at most 2 areas of your life that you want to use this cycle in, and use the cycle there. But then in other areas of your life, lower the bar, like relax. Because if you're constantly stressing yourself, it's no different than constantly being in the gym working on bicep curls. If you've got a 6-month-old infant, it's probably not the right time to try to train for your 3-hour marathon. So it's about, not trying to do everything at once at the highest level. Back to your other question, I should mention there's one exception about rest, which is universal, and that's the importance of sleep. So there is so much research that shows that whether you are trying to grow your physical body, your emotional control, your willpower, your creativity, sleep is the ultimate facilitator of all those things. So your body doesn't grow when you're training at the gym. Your body grows when you're sleeping. That's when all the good growth promoting hormones flood your system. Your mind, you don't necessarily have creative ideas when you're working, but your brain, when you're sleeping, that's when it goes through all the information you are exposed to. It stores it, it connects it, so the next day you can have a breakthrough idea. Same thing with your willpower. If you spend a really tough day exerting willpower and you sleep 8 hours, you are much, much more likely to refuel your willpower the next day than if you don't sleep. So sleep is like, I can't stress enough the importance of sleep as recovery. Whether you're trying to be the best athlete you can be, whether you're trying to be a creator, whether you're trying to stick to a new healthy habit, sleep is so important. So that's a part of recovery that's completely non-negotiable.
Yeah, I agree on that one. There is this notion, because you mentioned to pick 1 or 2 areas to improve in. So how long does it take until you can pick a new one, right? There's this notion of the 10,000 hour rule until mastery. So what did you find out, and what would be a guideline for people in terms of timing, or how do they spend that time most effectively?
So here I would say that it really depends on what your goal is. So if your goal is to be the best in the world at something, it might be 15 years before you pick a new area. The easy example there is Olympians. Their lives are very narrow and singularly focused. They often don't have families. They often don't have kids. Their friend circle is only the people that they train with because they are so focused on achieving this mastery and being the best in the world. Most people don't necessarily strive to be the best in the world at what they do. So for those people, it's around, well, when did you achieve your goal? Or for a lot of people, because life is short and we're all going to die, it's like, well, when are you sick of this? You know, I had a goal to run a marathon in under 3 hours, and I worked fairly seriously at that, I'd say for 5 years. And I'm not built like a runner, so it was very hard for me. And I got really close. I think I ran like a 3:01. I was 1 minute away. And at that point, I was just kind of tired of it. You know, I'm like, I'm not a professional runner. Like, this is taking a lot of energy. I'm going to start devoting this energy elsewhere in my life. So I transitioned. So I don't necessarily think that there should be any judgment around when you shift. It's more if you just try to do everything at once. That's the problem. What I will say is I think you should give everything at least 2 months. So if you're trying something new, you should give it at least 2 months before you move on to something else. Because for a lot of challenges and a lot of habits, the delay of when you start something and when you start to realize the benefits of it is 2 weeks to 2 months. And that's not just some like, self-help kind of myth. The human body on a cellular level, it takes two weeks to adapt to any change. So if you start eating a new diet, it takes your cells 2 weeks to adapt. If you start lifting weights, I don't care how hard you work out today, it won't be 2 weeks until you start to realize some of those adaptations.
That's fascinating. And what happens in those, let's say you were to do it for 2 weeks or a month or 2 months, and you introduce something like cheat days or you get off plan, how does that affect either the chances of success or the speed of adaptation?
This is such a good question, and it completely depends on the person and their plan. So if you see a quote unquote cheat day as a rest day and a chance to rest and recover, and you treat it that way, then it can be really beneficial. So if you're really meticulously sticking to a new nutrition plan 6 days a week, and you have a quote unquote cheat day, and that's your recovery day, and that allows you to stick to the next 6 days, then it can be really beneficial. Within reason, if the cheat day is consuming, 7,000 calories of fried donuts, then it doesn't matter how good you are the other 6 days, you're going to feel like shit, like it's not helpful. So I would go away from a cheat day because even the framing of that is negative and more to like a recovery meal or a recovery day. Now, I think what happens over time is, let's say that recovery day, at first, it's the whole day. Then maybe after 2 weeks, you say, I'm only going to have a recovery lunch and dinner. And then after a month, it's actually, I'm only going to quote unquote cheat at my dinner. Because you're basically giving your body a chance to change. And then what ultimately happens with people that have made successful lifestyle changes is they no longer want to eat the fried donuts because they don't like how the fried donuts make them feel. That takes a long time, and there's still a temptation. So no one's perfect, but maybe what happens is they eat the fried donuts, and then instead of eating them all day, they kind of realize earlier, I'm not going to feel good, so they stop. And I'm using nutrition as an example, but for me, this example is social media. So social media is like the candy in my life as a writer, right? It feels really good to see people reacting to your stories and to be on it, and you get this huge dopamine rush, but it doesn't really leave me feeling very good. Not in the same way that writing does. So let's say that writing is eating brown rice and kale and salmon, and social media is eating peanut butter M&Ms. Well, in the moment, peanut M&Ms always taste better. But if I stuff my face with peanut M&Ms nonstop, I'm going to feel like crap at the end of the day. So my evolution in this area of my life, it's not that I don't like peanut M&Ms and I still want to eat them. It's just that I have a little bit easier of a time knowing that I should stop. So old me might get sucked into social media and spend 7 hours just down the freaking rabbit hole and feel totally empty at the end of the day. New me might only spend a half an hour because I have enough experience now knowing that even though this tastes good right now, it'd be a lot better if I started eating brown rice and kale, which for me means reading, writing, having conversations that are meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And is the quality of rest defined mostly by the time, or also how you spend that time? And if so, what can you do during the rest period?
I think it's both. So it's quality and quantity. Quantity is simple, right? It's just the duration. For quality, I like to think of it as anything that is a fundamental switch from the muscle that you've been using. So for an elite athlete, rest would not be exercise. Rest would be probably lying on the couch, reading a book, watching TV, writing, you name it. For a writer, rest might be exercise because it's using a different system or a different muscle. So I think the quality of rest is how separate it is from the thing that you're stressing yourself in, if that makes sense. So you want it to be a very, very clear switch to a different muscle. Is A. B is sleep, again, so sleep across the board, everybody benefits from and needs. And then C would be, you also want your rest period to be something where the stakes aren't so high. So let's say that I'm training really hard to be a great athlete, but I'm also really trying to publish a book. You can't necessarily say that rest is switching from sports to publishing the book because both of those areas feel like stress. So certainly in my life, again, as a writer that cares deeply about my training, is just a hobby athlete, but one that cares about it, I won't chase big athletic goals when I'm in the book writing process. Because even though they seem totally different, there's only so much psychic mental energy for me to push hard in one area. So again, and this is top of mind because right now I'm working on a book. So when I'm not working on a book, maybe I go to the gym. COVID also changed things, but maybe I'll go to the gym 4 days a week and I'll really be pushing my body. When I'm working on a book, I only go to the gym 3 days a week, and I'm content to say that my exercise for the day might just be a 45-minute walk.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't want to have to push and care about metrics and numbers and am I improving when I'm also throwing myself into writing a book.
Mm. Yeah, that makes total sense, and thank you so much for sharing that.
This is a part of my my second book, The Passion Paradox, that gets to like this, certainly here in America, like a very large cultural misconception, and that is that everybody should try to be balanced. So I think that's crap, because the way that balanced is interpreted is you should have be great at everything at the same time. So you should be a great parent, a great colleague, you should eat really healthy, you should exercise, you should make sure that you're all caught up on Game of Thrones, you should sleep 8 hours at night, you should know how to bake, and next thing you know, the pressure cooker is full. So I think far better than a goal of balance is to really prioritize, these are the things in my life I care about, to give yourself permission to go all in on them, and to make sure that you're reflecting constantly, are you spending your energy how you want? What's fascinating across all my writing for both books, the highest performers that are also the happiest people, if you zoom in at any one point of their life, they look completely unbalanced. But if you zoom out and look across their whole life, they look extremely balanced. So they have seasons. There's a season for spending so much time with my young kids. There's a season for trying to write a book. There's a season for trying to be the best athlete I can be. There's a season for launching a business. They're really, really good about never trying to do everything at once, but defining their priorities, going all in, and then switching when the season changes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. One area I would love to explore is, because let's say I'm always consciously have to do a certain habit or go to exercise. What are the things that make it easier over time? Talking about either routines, building habits, setting up environments. What have you found that helps along those ways lines?
Everything that you just said. So routines and setting up environments, I think, are the most important thing. So you can think of starting a new habit or sticking to a habit at first when it's not necessarily comfortable. You want to remove any friction between you and the habit. So for nutrition, friction could be If you've got unhealthy food in the house, that's a friction point if you're trying to eat healthy, because it gets in the way. Literally, it rubs against your goal. So you want to move the healthy food out of the house. If you're trying not to check your phone all the time, maybe you should store your phone in the garage in your car overnight. For physical activity, if you really struggle with the motivation to get up and go to the gym early in the morning, you should probably pack your gym bag the night before and have it in your car, because it's one less thing that gets in the way between you and what you're doing. So it's identifying these friction points, doing whatever you can to make the habit easier, and then building a routine around that. So when you talk about designing your environment, to me, that's just removing friction. Because environment doesn't always have to be physical surroundings. It could literally be, well, I'm packing my bag the night before. So that's really important. And then the power of routine is it automates something so you don't have to think about it. So people approach this differently. I'm a big believer, especially with nutrition, that early on in a nutritional change, it's really good to have a very prescriptive plan, because it's one less thing to think about. You just show up and eat the food that you know you need to eat that day. People might say, well, that takes the joy out of eating and all this stuff. I hear that, but focus on this for 2 months, and then 2 months from now, your body will have adapted and you can be more intuitive about it. So I think that early on, really being rigorous about just executing and knowing what you need to do and not having to think about it, not having stuff that gets in the way, not having stuff that tempts you, that's the really important stuff.
Yeah. I know in your book you mentioned, or at least I understood it that way, that people can also be a friction point, and that you have to choose carefully who you spend time with. Does that mean for a certain period of time we should maybe not see, let's say I want to stop drinking alcohol, so for a certain period of time I'm not seeing those friends? For how long is it? Is it permanent? Like, how do you handle those social situations that might take you off track?
I think that you have to strike this really fine balance between prioritizing the change that you want to make, thinking through how much harder does it become if you put yourself in certain social environments, and then thinking about what you lose if you take yourself out of those social environments. So for an alcoholic whose friends are tied up in drinking, I would say that, yeah, remove yourself. It's worth it. For somebody that's a casual drinker that maybe wants to go from 3 drinks a week down to 0, but all their best friends are the people that go have cocktail hours, that's a lot tougher trade-off to make. So I think, again, it gets back to what are the stakes of the change? And then, yeah, I think that if you're really trying to break a harder behavior, kind of similar to what I was saying earlier, up front, it makes sense to be more restrictive and more rigorous. And then later on, not so much. And I think the example of, and I certainly know that you didn't mean like an extreme, but I think the example of an addict is a good one, who at first might need to totally remove themselves from their addiction. But then over time, they can be in the same situation as their addiction because they've worked up the ability not to cave in. But it depends. Like for a lot of people, especially with health habits like eating, drinking, smoking, a lot of people, their whole social life gets tied up in this negative habit. And that's a really challenging thing to work through. And that can be really hard. Like if all your best friends, have very unhealthy lifestyles and you're spending all your time with them, then it's going to be very, very hard for you to get into a healthy lifestyle. And these are very, very personal choices. These are choices that sometimes people should speak with a therapist about, because this is the kind of stuff where the rubber really meets the road.
Yeah, absolutely. One question I have here is, how do you strengthen your ability not to cave in, right? Because let's say when you're working on something by yourself, it's always easier.
It's easy. Yeah. So I think that you got to be kind to yourself and realize that any path to meaningful change, you're going to cave in all the time. So the goal isn't not to cave in. The goal is to realize that you cave in a little bit faster than you did the time before. So this gets back to I caved in and I ate a ton of fried chicken. Well, in the past, I would just say, screw it, I'm off the diet and I'm going to eat like crap tomorrow. But now victory looks like, oh, I caved in, that sucked, but whatever. This is really hard. I'm going to get back on the bandwagon and start again tomorrow. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is really feel in your body how you feel after you cave in. So not just in the moment that you're having the drink or you're taking the bite of fried chicken, but feel what it's like an hour after, 2 hours after, 3 hours after, the next day, and let that feeling sink in. Because if you feel like crap, then that feeling is going to drive your future behavior. And I think the point on self-compassion is really, really important, because there's this myth that like you got to be really hard on yourself if you mess up, but all the research shows it's the exact opposite. The more that you can be kind to yourself after you fail, the easier it is to get back up and get back on the bandwagon. So like certainly in areas of my life where I'm trying to improve, when I cave in, and again, expect to cave in because change is hard. Of course you're going to cave in. When I do, before I started researching and writing about this stuff, I would have been really hard on myself, but then I would have felt guilt and shame, which then just leads to more of the negative behavior. So now when I cave in, it's just simple. I say, ooh, like this is what's happening right now. I'm doing the best that I can. I'm aware that this is happening. I'm going to feel what it makes me feel like. And I wish I didn't do this, but I did. So I'm going to start again tomorrow. And that is so much more effective than you suck, you're off the diet again. You like it, that stuff just never works.
So speaking of falling off the bandwagon, when that happens, a lot of people, they're waiting for motivation to come back, right? And then they make the decision to get back onto the bandwagon dependent on that motivation that hopefully comes up.
I'm so glad you're asking. This is one of my, sorry to cut you off. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So in all of my time researching, this might be like the most stress plus rest equals growth for sure. And then this rule might be like the most profound thing that I've come across. And people think that they need to feel motivated to get going. The opposite is what's true. And this is borne out in all the research. You get going and then you feel good. You can't wait to feel motivated or inspired to do something. You have to do the thing and then you feel good and motivated and inspired. I freaking love strength training. I love writing. I rarely want to strength train or write. I just know myself well enough to know that I just got to start for 15 minutes and then I'll get stoked. If I were to confuse motivation with action, I would probably lie in bed, not doing much, 5 out of 7 days a week. So for me, man, has that been an important learning, that you don't have to feel motivated to get started. You get started and then you feel motivated. You get into this inertia and this rhythm and then it gets easier. And certain things are never easy. Like I almost never want to face the blank page and start writing. And I've written 2 books, multiple New York Times essays. Like I am a pro writer and I do this for a job. And I very rarely look forward to facing the blank page. I just know that once I start writing, I'll feel pretty good most of the time. Same thing with training. Most mornings I'm like not super stoked to train. I'm stiff. I'd kind of rather like sit on social media. But again, my brain has learned that if I want to start feeling good, I just need to do the thing. So a good friend of mine and someone that you might know, Rich Roll, he's a plant-based athlete with a very popular podcast. The way that he puts it is he says mood follows action. And so many of us think that action follows mood, but it's the total opposite. And again, for those in the summit that really want to nerd out, there's fascinating research in psychology, and especially clinical psychology, around this notion of behavioral activation, which is probably the best way to treat depression. And what behavioral activation says is that for somebody that is clinically depressed, you shouldn't try to change how they're thinking or feeling. What you should do is you should just kind of nudge yourself to get acting. So life is meaningless. The world is going to end. All this stuff is terrible. I'm worthless. With the help of a therapist, because it's really freaking hard. But okay, life is meaningless. I'm worthless. The world is going to end, but I'm going to force myself to go to the gym today. And it's that pattern that gets people out of depression. And I by no means am I suggesting that you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do it alone. You have to couch all of that in tons of help and love. But it's very, very, very hard to change thoughts and feelings it's very hard but doable to change actions. And that is so, so, so important. Again, this is one of my favorite areas to nerd out in the research is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a really well-researched effective treatment for mental illness. It's the B part of it that is the strongest. So the cognitive part, like changing how you think, really hard. The behavioral part, changing your behaviors, much, much easier and much more effective. Anxiety is another great example because I like to look to the extremes because I feel like in the extremes we see these truths. So for somebody that is really, really anxious, let's say that they have a social anxiety, they can't be around other people. The way to get that person through it is to force them, literally it's called exposure therapy, force them to show up and throw themselves around other people. And then the anxiety goes away after. One of my favorite studies shows that the most effective way to treat someone with social anxiety is to make them go into a crowded Starbucks and like spill coffee on other people. And it sucks for the other people, but for that person with anxiety, they're literally retraining their whole mind-body system that, hey, the world's not going to end if this happens. And with someone that's experienced anxiety, this kind of treatment is so, so painful and hard when you're going through it, but it's so effective. And it's so then for something that's less intense as clinical anxiety, like just simply feeling good to start your day. Yeah, like you don't have to feel good, just get going. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I'm really glad you asked it because I think it's such a powerful myth in personal growth and self-improvement is that you need to be really motivated and inspired. And motivation and inspiration are great. Don't get me wrong. Like when it happens, use it, but you can't rely on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and expanding on that, because you mentioned that certain people have anxiety in social situations, or they perceive they have certain limits. Where do those mental limits come from, and how do you know that you have one?
That's a good question. Where do they come from? I think some of it is probably nature, like genetics, right? Like actual limits, and then some of it is cultural and nurture. So the people you surround yourself with, again, definitely shape how you think and behave. The culture that you're a part of, the story that you've been telling yourself. So if you've been telling yourself a story that I can't improve or I can't get better at this thing, then that becomes a self-imposed limit. And sometimes it requires just going to test that limit and saying, screw it. If I fail, I fail, but I'm going to try to test it. And then you break the limit and then you're okay. Again, back to the person with really bad clinical anxiety. And for someone that hasn't experienced that, it can literally feel like you are going to die if you do the thing that makes you anxious. But the only way to get over that is to go do the thing that makes you anxious and see that you don't die. Again, in that case, with the help of a therapist. But I think it's just sometimes you have to test that limit and be willing to fail.
Yeah.
And coaching can help. Like I keep saying for mental illness, make sure you have a therapist. Well, for something that's not that much, a coach that can tell you, like, it's on me. Like if you mess up, I'll take responsibility just to kind of offload you a little bit. That can be really helpful.
Yeah, and it also sounds like when you said that sometimes you just got to take that action to get motivated. So what is drawing you forward in that moment where you say, okay, I'm going to take action? What is the pulling force?
So I think it can depend. I think that, you know, a really nice, tidy narrative, and it's an effective one, is if you have like these core values or things that you really believe in, you just want to show up and act in alignment with them every day. So if one of my core values is creativity, well, then it makes it really easy for me. I'm going to write, whether I want to or not, whether I feel like it or not, because that's my core value. On down days where there's a lot more friction and you're like, well, my core value is creativity, but I don't care. Like, I don't want to do this. I think it's just really, to be honest, my experience personally and in those that I've worked with and in the research and reporting, it's just practice. So you do this enough where you realize that whatever you're feeling right now, your brain telling you that you can't get started, you don't want to, that's just noise. And you kind of just have to identify it and say like, oh, there's my brain doing what my brain does, but I'm going to like gently ignore it. And that just takes practice. And again, like what changes isn't necessarily the feeling. What changes is how seriously you take it. So before you get into this path of mood follows action, your brain tells you you can't do this, it's lazy, don't get started. You really pay close attention to it. You think it's the truth. 4 years down this path, your brain says you can't do it, you can't get started. You can literally say, oh, there you are, brain, like doing what you do. I'm going to get started anyway, and we'll see what happens.
I think that's so fascinating how you can manage yourself in a way and also ignore your whatever noises or voices are going on in your head.
Meditation, any kind of contemplative practice can be so helpful for this, because what we're talking about really is separating a deeper sense of yourself versus the thoughts and feelings that you have. And mindfulness meditation is the practice that I'm most familiar with, can really help you see that you are not your thoughts or your feelings. And a really good meditator can sit back and say, oh, there's a thought. Oh, there's a feeling. And they create this huge amount of space between them and their thoughts and feelings. And it's the them over here that can decide what they want to do with it. So I like to think of meditation as you go through life fused. I have a thought, I am the thought. What meditation helps you realize is that you're actually not the thought. You get to choose what to do with it. It's really, really hard to expand this. And it's not like a one-time thing. I think for most people, the experience is you have this space and then it collapses. And then you have space and then it collapses.
Yeah, that's fascinating and so powerful, which makes me wonder, maybe you can share with everyone how you got started on this journey, on either discovering peak performance or even becoming a writer on this topic.
Yeah, so I've just I've had a lot of lucky breaks, and I've been really curious about this stuff, and I always write not because I have something figured out, but I write because I want to figure it out. So I write these books for me just as much as anyone else. So I've experienced burnout, I've experienced anxiety. So these are all things that I'm working through on the page. And I'm just fortunate that a lot of other people are really interested in how to avoid burnout, how to be a peak performer. So they come along for the ride with me. So for me, it's really just been trying to master these things. And a big part of how I do that is through the writing process.
Yeah. Obviously nowadays we face a lot of stress with the pandemic, uncertainty everywhere. So how do you deal with stress? And is there any shortcuts to handling stress?
So I think that the most important things are kind of just the foundation of building a capacity to absorb stress. And the evidence there is really clear that regular physical activity, sleep, good nutrition, and social connection are by far the most important things. So I think that before we talk about any hacks or shortcuts, focus on that base. And I think a part of what is making the coronavirus pandemic so hard is the social connection element that we rely on isn't as straightforward. That's a really hard thing, because normally in times of uncertainty and distress, the first thing you do is you go hug the person that you love. And for a lot of people, they can't do that. So I think it's just acknowledging that sucks and it's going to be harder, and that's okay, and accepting that it's going to be really hard. And then obviously using tools like Zoom and FaceTime and to get as close as you can to that. And then the other thing that can be really helpful is to set a really low expectation. Because if you set a high expectation, like this is going to be over in 2 weeks and it's not met, you'll be really sad. But if you set a really low expectation and you adjust to that new normal, then all that can happen is you can be pleasantly surprised. So for instance, my family and I were moving to a different state later this year. And my wife, sometimes, not to throw her under the bus, she's like, I can't wait to see our families and have a little vacation and all this stuff. And I'm like, Caitlin, 2 goals for this year: move to North Carolina and not die. And if we do those 2 things, this year is a great success. Anything else is a bonus. And again, that's not just like my theory. There's all kinds of research that shows that our mood is a function of our expectations. So when our reality is better than our expectations, we feel great. When our reality is worse than our expectations, we feel like shit. So in a period like this, I recommend setting a really low expectation and then taking anything else that comes as a positive.
I love that. I love that. As a closing word to anyone who's listening and they have a goal in mind, either be it athletic or healthy eating or whichever they're focusing on at the moment, what would you say to them if they're hesitant to go all in or they're hesitant to actually go after their goal?
I would say that it's really important to be kind to yourself and to realize that when you go all in and you really care about something and you go for it, you make yourself really vulnerable because there's a chance that you're going to fail or that things won't go as planned, and that's going to hurt and that's going to suck. But that's just the cost of having skin in the game, and I think it's worth it. I would rather have a life where I have skin in the game and I really go for the things I care about, even if it means that there are going to be days, weeks, maybe even months where I am just in hurt and pain because it didn't go well, then kind of just coast. And I think for those times when things don't go well, it's so important to be kind to yourself and to surround yourself with other people who also have skin in the game, because they can hold you up when you fail because they get it. The example I give is, you think way back to primary school, there were always the kids that like were too cool to try versus the kids that really tried. Don't be too cool to try. That's it basically. But trying's hard because you try and you fail and it sucks.
Yeah, but I love your analogy. I'd rather have a life with skin in the game than a life where I don't have it. Thank you so much, Brett. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Tobias. I really enjoyed the conversation.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. A wise man once said, "You make a new life by making new choices." Now, if you know that what you eat matters, if you know that health comes from healthy living, then the time to make new choices is now. And just imagine owning the summit for life. Click the button for more. Maybe you know our stories. Luke and I lost family to cancer, and we wish we would have known sooner what you are learning here today. So please, share the summit, take action, and let's support each other. Thank you. This is Toby and Luke signing off, and we can't wait to see you for the next presentation.